Okay. Welcome. 11 April, dis&datinformation, the autonomous collective.net. There are a couple of interesting ideas that are part of the things I've been fiddling around with before. I think I mentioned a little bit about catastrophe, or the theory of catastrophe, or catastrophe theory, depending on how you want to look at it. And it, in fact, of course, represents a form of chaos. But that's kind of the issue, is that one can argue that it has a certain shape or form, or it's possible to argue that it has a certain shape or form. And one of the interesting arguments about it, of course, is the discourse of discussing it. And on the issue of paths not taken, a while back, I came across a book by Avram Stroll called Surfaces. And came out in an interesting time, but that's another story. Now, the interesting thing about surfaces is that it's a kind of an old argument. Descartes argues about it in reference to trying to figure out what happens in transubstantiation. Um, in other words, what is the surface of the bread, and does the bread in transubstantiation, at what moment is it bread or not bread? And so that's sort of an interesting argument. Anyway, so it's not anything terribly new when you talk about a surface, but Stroll, in particular, is pursuing an idea that goes all the way back to the perceptual psychologist J.J. Gibson. And so much of this is sort of a something pursued while that began when I was an undergraduate. Anyway, this is from his book, Surfaces, Chapter 1, or Introduction, then Chapter 1. Philosophy is an ancient activity with a pronounced disposition to examine almost obsessively a small range of problems, returning to them again and again from this perspective and that. Yet it also has a surprising capacity, no doubt related to that propensity to generate new research ideas and indeed whole new disciplines. Since the time of the Greeks, we have seen natural philosophy become physics, puzzles about the mind become psychology, and a concern with language become linguistics. It is precisely this concentration upon such traditional issues that has led me to the topic of surfaces. The result is, I think, a new subject in philosophy, or at least it is new in the sense that this book represents its first detailed study. As a way of introducing it, I would like to describe two problems in which the notion of a surface plays an essential role. The first of these has no named classical model, yet its mere statement will evoke familiar associations. The second I shall formulate in more traditional language, but with an emphasis upon surfaces. It will undergo a metamorphosis and assume a different look. This way of broaching the subject has several advantages. It will allow us to approach the tradition in fresh and illuminating ways, pouring new wine into old wineskins, as it were. In particular, we shall show that some of the central issues of epistemology, thought to arise from the fact of perceptual illusion, can be reformulated in terms of the role that surfaces play in perception. This approach has one clear advantage over sense data theory, inasmuch as the existence of surfaces is unproblematic. That is, I contend that these issues do not basically depend on the existence of sense data, and that a surface-analysis, paradoxically enough, can carry us to the deepest levels of these problems. Finally, it will also show us why the subject should be taken seriously in its own right, and especially how it has the capacity to generate its own set of questions. Where are the edges? Here's our first problem. A cube, say an ivory die, has six surfaces. A die is a single of a dice of dice, a pair of dice, right? Its surfaces are contiguous. They abut one another, leaving no space between them. Together, they exhaust all the outer area of a cube. A cube also has 12 edges. But if its surfaces leave no empty space, then where are its edges? Now, suppose one answers by saying the edges are nowhere. They are imaginary lines, abstractions. By definition, an abstraction occupies no space. Thus, the edges are not literally between the surfaces at all. This answer commits one to the existence of abstractions. That is already a major philosophical step, but is it a correct one? There are good reasons for thinking it isn't. The edges of a cube can be said to be jagged or rough or wavy, and they can be painted red in contrast to the ivory surfaces. A person of talent can balance a cube on one of its edges. If edges have such physical properties and are susceptible to such operations, they cannot be mere abstractions, mere imaginary lines. They are no less ivory than the die itself, and are as much a physical part of the die as its surfaces are. But if they are literally between the surfaces. Hence, they're somewhere. Then are the surfaces not contiguous at all? Given these incompatible answers and what seem like strong supporting reasons for each of them, we have a dilemma. As we shall see, the difficulty does not stop with edges. We can apply the same reasoning to surfaces, conceiving of them as abstractions, and also under a different construal as physical entities, and thus conceiving of them in incompatible ways. Indeed, the same can be said about all the concepts that belong to what I call the geometry of ordinary speech. That is, borders, boundaries, sides, margins, rims, and so on. What seems to be a trivial puzzle has become very complex. Still, what seemed to be an unfamiliar puzzle is beginning to take on a more familiar look, having something to do with abstract entities and their physical embodiments. Now, we've come very close to the tradition at this point. For now, we'll go no further, but we'll explore the matter carefully in the text. Our purpose here has simply been to whet some appetites. Number two, surfaces and the external world. Our second problem needs no introduction. It's very familiar. The issue is how we obtain knowledge of the external world, if we do at all. A common answer is that we do so through the senses, in particular by means of the faculty of sight. This answer, in turn, leads to the issue of how reliable vision is. Does it allow, or at least sometimes for the apprehension of the world as it is, or does it distort it in certain ways? And if so, how is knowledge of the world possible? A traditional way of posing the problem is to ask, do we ever see the external world directly? The difficulty is one that philosophers from time immemorial have tried to solve. The answers have ranged from types of radical skepticism about the reliability of perception to affirmations of direct realism, the view that there is an external world and that we can and do apprehend it directly. In the 20th century, surface talk comes to play an important role in the formation of and attempted solutions to the problem. Once talk about surfaces is introduced, the problem, already subtle and complicated, becomes even more so. Let us see how this can happen using the work of the late distinguished psychologist J.J. Gibson to illustrate the point. In his last book, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, published in 1979, Gibson described himself as a direct realist, stressing by that appellation his opposition to all theories of perception that assume the objects of which we are immediately aware to be sensory objects, images, or mental representation. These subjective objects give us knowledge about the external world, according to these theories, but only after a complex process of inference, association, and interpretation is applied to them. In short, according to Gibson, most philosophers and psychologists hold that what is directly perceived are mental representations, And it is only indirectly through the mediation of these representations that we perceive the external world. Gibson's theory that the perception of environmental objects and features is based on ecologically available information challenged this widespread consensus. Thus, Gibson referred to his theory as a form of direct realism, and that he claimed that it was possible to perceive the external world directly on the basis of information, not indirectly through images and mental representation. Now, note that that's obviously where I was headed about the idea of it's possible to perceive the external world directly on the basis of information. For Gibson, surfaces play a key role in the process of the direct visual apprehension of external objects. We see external objects directly in the course of seeing their surfaces directly. He writes that it is at the surface of an object that most of the action of vision takes place. For it is the surface that reflects or absorbs light and thus provides the information contained in light which the human visual system picks up. Moreover, on his view, surfaces structure the visual world for us. They provide corners, edges, seams, shapes, margins, and borders. Accordingly, what the environment looks like to a human percipient is determined by the composition, layout, and textures that the surfaces of things have and by their relationship to the human visual system. In chapters 7 and 8, we shall explore in detail the issue between Gibson and his contemporary critics, focusing on the question whether we see the world directly or indirectly. But for the moment, our purpose is to show how surface talk complicates the issue. Suppose, like Gibson, one wishes to defend a form of direct realism, and suppose that one's analysis begins with the simplest sorts of cases, that is, the perception under normal conditions of an opaque object, like a baseball or a billiard ball. Then one may develop a train of argumentation to the effect that under those conditions one is directly apprehending such an opaque object, but not all of it. And why not all of it? The answer is that if the object is opaque, one can't see at that moment and from that place its reverse side or its interior. Now, how much of it can one see then? Again, there's a plausible answer, just part of its surface. And why is this answer plausible? The argument continues. Every opaque object has an exterior or outer aspect. That outer aspect is its surface. Since the object is opaque, one can't see its whole surface. That would require seeing both the obverse and reverse sides at the same time, which is impossible. So all one can see from a given place and at a given moment is the part of the surface that presents itself to the observer. Thus, one can see only part of the object, in fact, just part of its surface. This line of argument leads to two different and important theses about perception. Number one, it is a necessary condition of seeing any visual opaque object that one see at least part of its surface. Number two, under normal conditions of observation, one can see at most only part of the surface of a visible opaque object. These principles are not merely possible views that one might hold. In fact, they have been held by distinguished philosophers of this century. Through such a train of thought, they have emphasized two common sense distinctions: the difference between seeing at least something and seeing at most something, and the difference between seeing part or all of something. It is clear that the notion of the surface plays an essential role in their arriving at such principles and corresponding distinctions. We can now illustrate how these discriminations deepen the problem of our knowledge of the external world. Let us concentrate about number two for a moment. According to 2, Roman numeral 2, there is no way of seeing more than part of the surface of an opaque object, with the qualification being understood that the act of perception is discrete, namely that it takes place at a given moment and at a given time. 2 also discriminates between seeing part of the object and the object itself. In the literature, this is taken to be a distinction between seeing part of the object and the whole object. Following this line of reasoning, we can now ask whether 2 implies that subsection 1, under the conditions described above, we do not see a whole opaque object, or whether it implies that 2, under those conditions, we see a whole opaque object, but not directly, and whether 2 implies that 3, under those conditions, we see a whole opaque object indirectly. Now, it'll be noticed that in 2 and 3, the concepts of seeing directly and seeing indirectly make an appearance. 1, 2, and 3 seem to follow from Roman numeral 2, and yet 1 and 2 seem to be incompatible. Now, why do they appear to follow from Roman numeral 2, and why do they seem to be incompatible? Take proposition 1, for instance. If at most we can only see a forward part of an object, it does seem to follow that we cannot see the whole object. For clearly, the whole object is more than a forward slice of itself. But then take 2. With the addition of some trivial premises, it seems to follow from Roman numeral 2. For Roman numeral 2 tells us that we do see the object all right. We do so in the course of seeing a segment of it. In effect, Roman numeral 2 implies that we don't see the whole object in the way that we see a forward slice of it. Now, a way of bringing out this point is to say that we see part of the surface directly and the rest of the object in some other way, but at least not directly. And that is precisely what 2 says. Yet on these plausible readings, argument 1 and 2, or propositions 1 and 2, turn out to be inconsistent, because proposition 1 implies that we do not see the whole object, whereas number 2 implies that we do. It also seems to be true that 2 implies 3, whereas 1 does not. 2 implies 3 because if we do not see the object, but not directly, then we must be seeing it indirectly. This seems to follow on the ground that directly and indirectly are not only antonyms, but contradictories. Therefore, if one sees Y but not directly, surely one must be seeing Y indirectly. Now, if we go back over this train of reasoning, we can see that it is composed of moves, nearly all of which seem cogent, but which, upon reflection, turn out to be problematic. Is it really true, as one claims, as Roman numeral 1 claims, that it is impossible to see an opaque object without seeing its surface? We shall find that the answer is no. Is it really true, as Roman numeral 2 affirms, that one can see, at most, only part of the surface of an opaque object? Again, we shall find the answer is no. Now, what about the stipulations that define normal cases of seeing? These hold that acts of perception are discrete. In other words, that what counts as a normal case of seeing is determined by what we see from this particular standpoint and at this particular moment. These stipulations will also be found to be dubious. Does, quote, A is seeing the opaque object Y itself, unquote, entail that, quote, A is seeing the whole object Y, unquote? Now, to this question, we shall also give a negative answer. The concept of seeing directly and seeing indirectly will not be found to be antonyms in the sense that the argument requires, and so forth. Now, let's go on. We saw that the direct realist wishes to demonstrate or prove that sometimes we see constituents of the external world directly. Now, to put this claim in concrete language, we can say that such a realist wishes to establish that sometimes we see things like baseballs and billiard balls directly. But on the realist's own grounds, do we? It seems not, for once the realist introduces surface talk, surface-talk, into the formulation of the problem, it seems as if surfaces become obstacles or intermediaries standing, as it were, between the observer and the whole object, or the object itself for that matter. It now appears that one can't directly grasp more than a thin forward slice of the external world rather than a substantial integral part of it, like a whole baseball. And yet the train of reasoning that led to such a particular result was compelling. It seems true that every opaque object has an outside, that its outside is its surface, that we can't see all of the object or even all of its surface, and so on. With the introduction of surface talk, the problem of the external world has suddenly taken a turn for the worse for the direct realist. It now seems as if surfaces function analogously to mental representations. Now, according to the tradition, representations are entities that are perceived directly in a way which the external world is not. On this account, surfaces are parts of objects and thus are parts of the external world. As such, they are not perceived directly. On this traditional account, representations function as intermediaries between an observer and the external one. They thus even mediate that observer's perception of surfaces. For the tradition, the problem of the external world arises when one reflects on the relationship between such intermediaries and the objective world. Do they mirror the world? And if they do, how can we know that they do? If they don't, aren't we cut off from the world and thus deprived of genuine knowledge about it? But if we now think of surfaces as intermediaries blocking one's perception of the object itself or the whole object, our problem becomes even deeper. It is as if we have double intermediaries between us and the world, mental representations and surfaces. Now, one begins to see the point of how surface talk seems unavoidable and yet trouble producing. But let us continue to describe the difficulties. If we return to our first problem about edges and surfaces, we realize that there are good grounds for thinking of surfaces as abstractions, just as there are good grounds for thinking of edges in that way. Now, suppose that surfaces are abstract entities, then they would not occupy space, and having no substance, they would not reflect light. They would thus be invisible. But if so, what are we seeing when we see the outside of an opaque object? If it is not a surface, what is it? In such a case, there is something we are seeing directly, and if so, what is that? But even these queries scratch only the surface. The complexities can be multiplied and not beyond necessity. Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, for instance, can be shown with trivial buttressing to entail that A, every opaque object has a surface. B, every opaque object has exactly one surface. Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 also presuppose, although they do not entail, that the following questions are always in order, are always sensible. C, how much of an opaque object Y can we see from here and now? D, how much of the surface of an opaque object Y can we see from here and now? We shall find that under certain conditions, these questions are not in order and are not sensible. We shall also find that there are good reasons for rejecting both A and B. Indeed, the difficulties that I've been describing, when explored in depth, will eventually lead us to reject all forms of direct and indirect realism. In the long history of epistemology, it has been assumed that our perception of the external world must be either direct or indirect, and that these are the only alternatives. As we have indicated, the contemporary debate is posed in these terms. In this book, beginning from an analysis of surfaces, I shall develop an argument in Chapter 8 that undercuts both positions. Its conclusion is that our perception of external objects in normal cases is neither direct nor indirect. Thus, I reject the assumption that it must be one or the other. Now, all that seems horribly logical, but it does raise other kinds of questions, not answered in certain types of logical constructions. Now, number 3, additional puzzles. I said earlier that apart from its power to enrich and deepen our understanding of certain traditional problems, the subject of surfaces is of interest in its own right. It raises some interesting questions, generates new themes and concepts, and offers new prospects for areas of research. I shall illustrate these points with 3 examples, beginning with the simplest and most local and working toward one that is more general. Number 1, when water is lying flat, as in a lake, it is subject to surface talk. We can say that the surface of the lake is rough or smooth today, that it is rippled, covered with oil, and so forth. But when water is gushing out of a hydrant, we do not apply surface talk to it. We withhold such ascriptions as being smooth, rippled, etc., from water in that configuration. Why? Well, now let's vary the example slightly. Suppose the surface of a lake is very rough today, its top layer of water is choppy, and thus the water rises and falls quickly. It is clear that where the air meets the air will rise and fall with the water. Yet we do not speak of the surface of the air in such a case. Again, why? These examples lead to some interesting and eventually quite general questions. Shall we say that when water is gushing out of a hydrant, it does not have a surface? Does air not have a surface? In other words, from the fact that we withhold surface talk from an object or from some medium when it is in a certain configuration, does it follow that the object or the medium does not have a surface? How do we decide whether something has a surface or whether it doesn't? This raises a challenging methodological problem which we shall want to address in due course. For science, of course, water, whether lying flat or gushing from a hose, has a surface. Air, in any of its configurations, has a surface. What is the relationship between our ordinary ways of describing water and air and the way that science describes them? Is the ordinary person's way of speaking an expression of a kind of folk physics, as some philosophers today think, a primitive way of describing the world which should be replaced by scientific modes of thought and description? Or does this way of speaking have its own kind of validity, a kind of purchase in reality that no scientific account can eliminate? Our simple puzzle about surfaces has quickly taken us a long way. Number two, it is plausible to think of a surface as a boundary. We saw earlier that an ivory cube, say, has 6 surfaces and 12 edges. Both its surfaces and edges function as boundaries of the cube, but as different kinds of boundary. Clearly, the edges are not surfaces, since there are 12 edges and only 6 surfaces on the cube. What kind of boundary is a surface? How does it differ from a side, say, or for that matter, from an edge? More generally, what is a boundary? Is it a kind of limit? But then, what is that? To explore this matter fully would consist in answering these questions and more. What is the difference between such boundary words as margin, border, verge, brink, rim, and surface? Is line a boundary word? And how does one decide the question? To my knowledge, these are new questions, and they have interesting philosophical implications. The concept of a surface, number 3, the concept of a surface is one of an indefinitely large number of notions that belong to what I've called the geometry of ordinary speech. Other terms that belong to this system of words are cube, triangle, square, side, top, corner, center, verge, margin, border, limit, and boundary. How large is the list of such concepts? How are these terms related to one another? Why should this group of words be called a geometry? How does this so-called geometry relate to the formal discipline of that name? Indeed, is there really such informal geometry at all? If there is, what is its purpose or function? Does it raise any philosophical issues? And if so, which? I shall be arguing later in this book that there exists such a geometry in ordinary speech, and that it has analogous functions to those found in plane and solid geometry and in topology. The attempt to describe this geometry and its functions in everyday speech will raise a host of profound and novel issues. All of these will emerge as our inquiry into the nature of surfaces proceeds, and we shall see how the logic of the investigation generates them. So, number 4, plan of the book, substance and methodology. As the reader can well surmise, the book thus has several interconnected themes and sub-themes. Some have to do with content, some with methodology. With respect to content, its primary project, as I have indicated, is the investigation of the common sense notion of a surface. By the common sense notion, I mean a concept that is pre-technical, or at least non-technical. In a non-pejorative sense of the term, we can say that it is a concept that belongs to folk physics or folk semantics. A second project, closely connected with the first, is an inquiry into what I have called the geometry of ordinary speech. This is the description of an investigation into the properties of a system of concepts, of which the concept of a surface is an especially important member. My assumption in this study is that this system of informal geometry is an aspect or feature of a deep-lying, non-technical view of the world that virtually all of us share. G.E. Moore called this the common sense view of the world. Ludwig Wittgenstein describes it as that which stands fast for us, and John Searle speaks of it as the background. I do not argue in this book that there is some such picture of the world that we inherit. I've done so elsewhere in a series of papers, but I presuppose that there is. What do I argue? That the system of informal geometry I'm now alluding to plays a special role in that common sense view. It is that aspect of it that human beings employ for organizing and structuring the world in quasi-geometric terms. Although I do not argue that this informal geometry is deeper, more primitive conceptually prior to, and indeed the basis for the refined and regimented mathematical and scientific treatments of geometric concepts, I in fact believe that these things are so. To argue this case in extenso would require another book. Instead, what I tried to show in this study is how such an informal geometric system relates to scientific and mathematical conceptions in certain cases where they impinge upon one another, in particular where and why they are at odds with one another. My treatment of these matters, then, is merely a first step, an effort to call attention to an interesting philosophical issue that will require further discussion and research. With respect to methodology, matters are still more complex, and no brief account, such as an introduction, mandates will speak adequately to them. Perhaps the simplest description of my practice here is to say that this is an essay in conceptual analysis, the investigation into the concept of a surface. In that sense, it's part of an enduring tradition in Western philosophy, a tradition that we can trace back at least to the Platonic dialogues in their treatment of such notions as justice and piety. But of course, the methodology here is not identical with Plato's. It is much more eclectic. One of its assumptions is that the nature of the underlying worldview that I have mentioned is to a considerable extent reflected in the way that ordinary, non-technical persons speak about it, or the way that persons engaged in technical activities speak about it when they're not engaged in those technical activities. So throughout the book, there's a constant eye on ordinary discourse. Searle has said, the price we pay for deliberately going against ordinary language is metaphor, oxymoron, and outright neologism. This is an insightful remark, one eliciting sympathy from me. Remember this, Searle, this is the same John Searle that discusses social ontology. This is an insightful remark, one eliciting sympathy from me, but in my considered opinion, it is too strong. Like Austin, J.L. Austin, rather of ordinary language philosophy, rather, I believe that ordinary language is the first word, if not the last word. So the book begins in chapter 2 with a careful phenomenological account of how ordinary persons speak about surfaces, aiming through such an endeavor to elicit the common sense conception that is embedded in ordinary speech. Surprisingly, such an inquiry reveals that the common sense conception contains at least two different and incompatible accounts of what surfaces are, between which we move from case to case, each account being internally coherent and a rich and fertile source for its theoretical counterparts in mathematics on the one hand, and the physical sciences on the other. That is, we shall find the putative common sense notion of a surface to be bifurcated between the conception of a surface as an abstract entity and the conception of a surface as a physical entity. Chapter 3 is devoted to a description of this tension, which is not fully articulated in ordinary discourse. The first word is thus not sufficient to capture the distinctions involved. In effect, we have uncovered a tension between ordinary ways of speaking about surfaces and the putative common sense view of surfaces. These issues will be found in chapter 4 to lead us still further away from questions that ordinary language in fact poses. These are questions connected with the seeing of surfaces, such as, quote, is it possible to see X without seeing its surface, unquote, And, quote, is it possible to see the surface of X without seeing X? Unquote. Here are some of the findings of science connected with such concepts as magnification and resolution become apposite. In chapters 5 and 6, we continue our investigation of perception and the role that surfaces play in that process, asking, for instance, whether and in what way surfaces might impede or block our perception of external objects. The discussion that ensues leads to a critical exposition of three philosophical defenses of direct realism. Chapter 7 continues the discussion with a fourth type of direct realist theory, J.J. Gibson's, and Chapter 8 enlarges and generalizes upon that discussion by asking whether we see the external world directly or indirectly. Chapters 9 and 10 return our focus to surfaces per se. Chapter 10, in particular, concerns the geometry of ordinary speech and addresses some of the issues I've alluded to at the beginning of this section. That is, the overall outline of the work. But enough, perhaps too much, of such meta talk. Let us now engage the subject itself, beginning with the question, what are surfaces? And so I have come to the end of this little chapter here, and I don't want to burden you further, but let me make some general comments. Obviously, this position from a philosophical view is driven by certain ideas about ordinary language philosophy, a philosophy that develops at the same time in concert with, in reaction to a variety of other things, people, Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher, one can argue a language philosopher, but he raises other questions aside from getting in fights with trying to thrash Karl Popper with a fireplace poker. But anyway, this is a interesting set of ideas that ultimately becomes under J.L. Austin, among other folks, something called ordinary language philosophy, which is not such a rigid school so much as it is a set of procedures of philosophy's interaction with linguistics at one level. At another level, it's certainly questions that raise certain ontological questions, which is where people like John Searle come in. Now, of course, in the issues of Western philosophy, and more notably, political questions or questions that involve a more post-war Marxism, for example, you can argue that this kind of divergence is kind of counterproductive or problematic or nonsense. Certainly, it's the case that Derrida makes such fun of John Searle in a similar sort of way, in terms of showing, as an example, a kind of framing argument with respect to Searle's work. Um, it is a kind of play, as it were, that makes some kind of epistemological questions possible. But needless to say, it kind of reflects on the difference over many decades between Anglo-American analytic philosophy and its pragmatic variants primarily, and continental philosophy, so-called continental philosophy. Are they talking about the same things? Are they, in fact, doing the same problem that we see here with surfaces? And it's an interesting question. And the fact that people like J.J. Gibson talk about a kind of ecology of perception, I think is worth considering. It's not necessarily worth considering as a matter of resurrection, but it is an interesting philosophical problem that raises, and in order to get back to my original set of points in doing this little series, is to work at certain kinds of differences. Some of them are critical discourse analysis problems. Some of them are problems of geospatial information analysis. Some of them are ways in which we can talk about reconciling the qualitative and the quantitative in ways that respect each other in that sense. Um, And at a very base sort of level, as it were, you can consider some things that are simply mathematical or that are posed in a way that are problematic in a mathematical way. And we know, of course, that it is precisely this difference in certain types of mathematical constructions that allow certain other scientific fields to evolve, physics, for example. And so it is this set of questions, ones which we see reflected, and I'm getting back to the sort of point of things that I've been doing in political economy, and that is that the question of configuring a dynamic economy in a macroeconomic sense with its micro foundations, because there are micro foundations, because there are people. So it is important to sort of come to grips with these kinds of ideas. Now, where all this comes from is probably an important and unimportant sense of personal direction or indirection in that the same sort of way, and paths not taken, I suppose. Not with any regret. It just simply is a different path to have taken, essentially to come back to the same sorts of points. So let's see if there are any questions. No, there aren't. With a few moments left, let me just say that this is an important book to me only because uh, I deployed Gibson's concepts in part in a series of sort of introductory texts, and I was asking certain kinds of questions about how is it that we gain information, how is it that we use data and transform it into information, um, and within a particular discourse context. So, for example, let's say you're in a teaching situation and you have a group of people and they are examining something, a physical object of some kind, and everyone is trying to interpret it. Um, Now, what is the range of issues that go about when we try to not only interpret but also explain, describe? Um, there's all of these language questions evolve when one is in a situation where we're all looking at the same thing, and yet we all have the same or different perceptions. And I would argue, of course, with Marx that there's some set of social relations that's going on in this one little small, micro-sized, as it were, group. And when you get to larger problems, like NFTs, for example, this question becomes more diffuse and problematic. One hopes that at a foundational level, you could just sort of say, well, we are discussing that thing, not unlike the scholars, blind scholars, discussing the elephant. What is it that we're coming to grips with? And is it about is it about blindness in that sense? So anyway, that's kind of where I was headed with this, and yes, I could talk about this further, but I won't. Let me stop share since I'm close to the end of my time. Let me note that after hours tonight, we'll do our usual thing. Um, I assume that we will have some interesting visual problems as well. I think there will be night gallery tonight and perhaps some other matters. So let me thank you for your attention. And let me note that this is not a digression. This is still fiddling around with the same problem. Remember that I showed the question of the kind of surface fold that occurs that René Thom talks about in catastrophe theory, and that it leaves a kind of shadow, statistical shadow, that is interesting, that is problematic on the one hand because it's dimensionally problematic, and that you don't sort of see everything at once, and yet you do once you see the catastrophe sort of explained on a kind of on the fold in the curve. So it's still all there. And we'll get to it eventually. And I think maybe you'll get to see some of that sort of stuff. So I'm going to stop share, stop the live stream, and return us to our regularly scheduled craziness.